All right. We are, of course, we're still in Romans. We will be for a while. But I want to look back at something first. If you were a Jew in the first century, and you were reading Paul's letter, this letter that he wrote to the Romans, you would probably be shocked at the way he spoke about the law. I mean, the way he spoke about the Torah. And if you were a Jew, the way he spoke about your Torah. The Jews highly esteemed the law of God. So what Paul has said would have been very troubling. And I want us to look at why I say that. Okay? Let's look back at Romans 3, verse 20. Who's got that?
I have that. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin.
Yeah, by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight. I mean, what Paul is saying here is that you can't become right with God. You can't be justified in his sight through the law. You cannot be made righteous by the law. All the law can do is bring you the knowledge of sin. But he goes on. Read the next verse, verse 21.
But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets.
Yeah, being made right with God comes apart from the law. There's another way that God has made justification available to us. The righteousness of God, apart from the law, has been manifested. The righteousness of God has been made known. That's what manifested means. It has been revealed. How? In Jesus. It has been revealed through Jesus Christ. He doesn't say that, but he's saying the righteousness of God has been made known.
Isn't that what the transfiguration was? Because you had Elijah and Moses, and then you have Jesus.
Yeah.
Isn't that what that was all about?
I think pretty much, but I really see the transfiguration as being a visual thing to the three disciples that saw it, of the transferring from the old covenant, the law and the prophets, to the new covenant, Jesus.
Isn't that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's what we are talking about, yeah. All right, so now let's look at, he keeps on going with this idea in Romans 3. Let's read Romans 3, verse 8.
3:28.
3:28, excuse me, yes.
For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law.
Yeah, here Paul is telling them, and he's telling us too, that it is those who are made heirs by faith that receive the promises made to Abraham. This doesn't come through the law. And that's why the Jews probably would have had a hard time with what Paul is writing. But let's read another one as he keeps on going. Now we'll go into chapter 4, and let's look at chapter 4, verse 13.
It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith.
Yeah, look what he's saying there. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise, but it was through the righteousness that comes how? Through faith. Comes by faith. Paul is telling them, and I mean, he's telling them all of these things, and that would have very much upset the Jews in those days. This verse is stipulating that it is not through the law that Abraham received and his ancestors received the promise, but it comes through the righteousness that comes by faith. And I want you to remember that Paul is writing to the Christian church in Rome. He's not writing to unbelieving Jews. Okay? He's not trying to convince those unbelieving Jews with this. This is a letter to the church. Okay? And he's helping them to understand what they believe and how they received all this. And we're not through yet, because in chapter 5 he continues his discourse in chapter 5, verse 20.
The law came in so that the transgression would increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more.
Yeah, here Paul's telling us that the law was given by God. Why? To increase the transgression. And wherever sin increased, wherever transgression increased, the grace of God superabounded. That's what that word is. It's abounded all the more Abounded all the more is actually one Greek word that means superabounded. Okay? And now we come to one of Paul's major points in chapter 6, verse 14.
For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace.
Yeah, if you remember, he's been talking about who is master over you. And sin, the realm of sin. That's, he's not talking about sin. He's talking about the realm of sin shall not be master over you. He said, you're not under the law. You are under grace. And we have to remember again that Paul's writing to believers, both Jew and Gentile, where he's speaking mostly here to the Jews. Okay? And what he's saying would probably have stunned them. They'd say, not under the law. Doesn't that make us Gentiles? If we're not under the law, how are we different from the Gentiles? Well, in chapter 7, Paul starts answering that question. This is where we were last time. Romans 7, verse 4. Who's got that?
He's also kind of telling them, hitting them upside the head with a 2x4 and saying rules and regulations are irrelevant.
Yeah,
And that they are highly regulated
that's right.
by tradition. And it's like, you guys are on the wrong road.
I mean, look, and that's what I want you to see. That is exactly what Paul is up against, okay? We think Paul, it was tough for Paul. It was nearly impossible for Paul because the Jews were after him, the Romans were after him. I mean, he had it tough. God was protecting him, obviously. But he's trying to change what the Jews have done for thousands of years, right? And
He's trying to tell them that that's all been satisfied.
That's
Some-
it,
and-
yeah,
but
that's
the
all
ones that
been
were so
satisfied, right.
Traditional in it, they
Right.
didn't want it to ever be satisfied. They
See,
just
to them,
wanted-
it wasn't going to be satisfied. You know, that was what they followed. Okay, and we're going to get there. So let's read Romans 7, verse 4.
Therefore, my brethren, you also were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God.
Yeah, you were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another. Okay. Now, what Paul is telling us is that the law barred them from marrying Jesus. That only death to the law could free them from the law to belong to Christ. And that's what he's trying to teach them, how to become dead to the law. So what we see in Paul's marriage analogy is that he's talking about Israel being married to the flesh, which is the body of Adam. Adam is the first one who sinned against God. Okay? And living under the law brings about sinful passions. You can't obey the law properly in the flesh. All right, so let's go to 7 verse 6 now.
But now we have been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter.
Yeah, you see what it's interesting there. We have been released from the law. That's very important to understand. We have been let go from the law. That's what Paul's telling them. And how? Because we died to it. And we died to that which we are bound. We were tied to the law. But now we have died to it, and we have been released from it. Why? So that we can serve in the newness of the Spirit and not the oldness of the letter of the law. Okay? And so he's building up to this. The law hinders life in the Spirit. You must be released from it. You must die to it so that you may serve in the newness of the Spirit. All right, let's go to, let's see, that was, yeah. Okay, if you were an Old Covenant Jew and not a New Covenant believer, all of this, to me, would sound like Paul was very negative about the law. I mean, he's very negative here about the law, isn't he? So, this is exactly what the Jews in Asia accused Paul of. Now, this is when Paul had already finished his third missionary journey, and he's back in Jerusalem. Let's go to Acts 21, verses 27 and 28.
When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place."
Yeah, he's getting accused of all sorts of things here, but it says, when the 7 days were almost over. Do you know what those 7 days were? Do you remember? We studied it. I know it's been a while. The 7 days were the elders of Jerusalem told Paul that they suggested to him that he purify himself. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
Because people were starting to say that he was against the Jewish traditions and the Jewish customs, and that he was against the law. So what you need to do, Paul, is to purify yourself with a Nazirite vow. Okay? And that's when the 7 days were almost over. And he was about to cut his hair. I think that's what happens on like the 7th day. They cut their hair off. I don't know why. It's all part of it. Okay? And but that's literally what is going on here. And then these Jews from Asia who have been following Paul on his missionary journeys, they've been causing trouble everywhere he went. Okay? And now they're in Jerusalem. They say, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to men everywhere that he goes against the people, against our people, and against the law." Okay? And the Jews in Asia are accusing him of speaking out against everything that they believe. Okay? And what Paul is speaking of would have, and obviously did indeed, inflame the Jews of his day, because they highly esteem the law of God. And what he's saying, they're not understanding exactly what he's saying, but we do.
Steve,
Yes.
I know I've asked this before, but the law is so general here. It's not the 10 Commandments. It's everything that's been added after that.
Man, how did that happen? This is so cool, because my next question was, what law is it that they're talking about? Is it the 10 Commandments? Sally, that's so perfect. Is it the 10 Commandments?
No.
No, it's so much more than that. It's not just them, but it's the 613 commandments that the rabbis added to everything, and they claimed that all these 16 commandments were in the Torah, and these are the things you had to follow. 248 mandatory things that you needed to do, and 365 prohibitory things that weren't supposed to be done.
It looks like they would be so glad to get rid of all those things. Why are they holding on to them?
Because they're just not believing the Messiah has come. Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah,
what they
Judy?
knew.
Yeah,
It's
God
always
gave
hard to
them
get
more
rid of
laws
it.
too. When
Oh, he did.
God gave them a lot of laws, but the reason sin increases with law is not like everybody started acting ugly or just because the definition of sin, I taught my children the catechism,
Sin is
is
any
any
want of conformity unto
or
or
transgression of the law of God.
I paid attention too.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why sin increases, because God gave more laws to be carried out.
Yeah.
And so that's what.
And the
that-
Jews
when it
made
talks about
sure
sin
that they
increasing.
kept, the Jewish rabbis made sure, the Pharisees and all those made sure they kept all these things.
But
you know?
God gave them a whole lot of laws.
He did.
But the Pharisees just took it all.
But think about if you were a good Israelite, okay? What are you doing? You're trying to keep the 248 and not do the 365. Can you imagine? I mean, to the first century Jew, the law was the most precious gift God ever gave them. But can you imagine keeping up with all that stuff? It'd be near impossible.
Like you're about to do something and then you're like, oh,
Uh-oh.
wish.
Well, and I think just to Sally's question, I mean, I think it's human nature. We are people who don't like change, and
Yeah.
and I think that's probably why. I mean,
I mean, it's structured.
they want to
their
do
lives.
things the way they've done them because that's the way they've always done them. I mean, it's like the Methodist Church. I mean, it's kind of like that. I mean,
And,
Yeah,
but-
Francis had something,
Okay.
yeah.
When we were in Israel, our tour guide, who was a Christian Israeli, said that one of the big debates for them is not to do work on Sunday among the Orthodox. And he said if they put their baby into a baby stroller, then the wheels of the stroller are working when they push it. Therefore, they are doing work. So they split hairs so far down that it's just hard to even exist.
And that's
you just
exactly
sit
what
still.
they've been doing for thousands of years.
They
right?
also put elevators in their hotels for pagans that don't honor the Sabbath and go take the stairs.
Even though we
That's
might,
what we did.
might not be as extreme. We tend to do the same thing though.
We do, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have rules we want to keep, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And make sure others keep them too, right?
We, each and every one of us has our own frame
Yeah,
that we follow.
absolutely.
And that thing over there, the law, was, they didn't have to make their frame, it was made for them.
Right.
It's a cage. And they were afraid to come out of their cage.
Okay, so now you've got this cage, you've got this framework that they're in. And along comes this man, Paul. Okay? Along comes this man, Paul, and he connects the law with the sin, with the sin of Adam. And it says they need to die to the law. Think about that. And not be under the law. So let's ask Paul. Paul, if a believer has died with respect to the sin, as you said in chapter 6, and if he died with respect, to the law for the Jews, as he's talking about in chapter 7, let's ask him, are you putting these things in the same category? Is sin, is the law sin? Well, that brings us to our next verse. Let's look, is the law sinful? Let's look at next verse. Romans 7, verse 7.
What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law. For I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet.
Yeah, so Paul says, what shall we say then? From all of this, what conclusion can we draw? Is the law sin? Are all these rules that you have followed for these thousands of years, is all that sin? And Paul answers his own question. What does he say? May it never be. That's the strongest no he can possibly give. May it never be.
My version says certainly not.
Yeah. Well, and he says, on the contrary, the law has been our educator. Okay? The law is not sin. The law reveals sin. Okay? Paul's saying the same thing he said earlier in chapter 3. He would not have come to know sin except through the law. He says, for I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. That's the example that he gives. The intention of the law is to prevent sin. So he said, the law says you shall not covet. To help you know that to covet, not to help you know not to covet, because it leads to sin. Okay? And the word known there is the Greek word gnosko. And gnosko is reserved for experiential knowledge, not intellectual knowledge. It's experiential knowledge. The law didn't merely give an academic understanding of sin. It made Israel aware of its power and its authority. The law exposed the true horror of the sin nature. Okay? So let me ask you, who first coveted?
Eve.
Who?
Eve.
You got that right. I was wondering if we were going to get that right.
Rusty got it. He didn't say
Eve,
that.
yeah. She desired to eat the forbidden fruit, didn't she? And it was the serpent who was enticing her to eat. Let's look at that. Let's look at Genesis 3, verse 1. Who's got that?
Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, indeed, as God said, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden.
Yeah, the serpent knew that God had commanded Adam and Eve not to eat from a certain tree. But he was beginning his enticement. He was, and Eve answered him. He asked the question, indeed, has God said that you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? I mean, is there anything you can't touch? He didn't say touch, he said eat. Okay? Now, how does she answer him in the next two verses?
The woman said to the serpent, from the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die.
Yep, and so she answers him. She said, from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, she didn't give it a name, but we know where that the tree was in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You shall not eat from it. And then she says, or touch it. Now, if you go back to Genesis 2, verse 17, which you can do on your own, God never says anything about touching it. He says, you shall not eat from the fruit. Okay? But Eve might have been, who knows, Eve might have been nervous and she just said, shouldn't eat or touch it. I have no idea. Okay, so now let's go to the serpent coming back at Eve.
The serpent said to the woman, "You surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil."
Yeah, here basically the serpent, Satan, told Eve, God is lying to you. Eating from this tree will be to your advantage. It will make you, it'll open your eyes. It says, once you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. On that day, that will make you happy and wise. It will then, and it was then that Eve began to covet. It was at that moment Eve began to covet, because we see that in the next verse. Read verse 6.
When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she also gave it to her husband with her, and he ate.
Yep. And this is, we've said this before. I didn't know Adam was there with her when she was talking to the serpent, but you see he was there with her when all this was being done, and she was doing all the talking. Imagine that. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So as Eve was coveting this fruit on the tree, well, let's look at what she saw, that it was good for food. So what's she doing there? She's rationalizing her desires. Okay, that's going to be good. We can eat that. Yeah, we can eat that. All right. And she saw that it was a delight to the eyes. It was very good to look at. But the word delight there is the Hebrew word tava. And tava means desire exceedingly or greedily lust after. Okay? So the lust is beginning. All this is starting to happen. And then she said, they said, and it was desirable to make one wise. Desirable is the Hebrew word shamad, which means greatly beloved, or yes, covet. So this whole coveting process is starting in Eve. All these emotions, all these desires are happening to Eve as she is told these lies by the serpent, by Satan. Has that ever happened to you?
No.
Oh, never.
No. Well, I can tell you it's happened to me, where I believe the lies that I'm fed. Yeah. Coveting shows that we have lost our contentment in where God has us, or in what God has us. We are yearning for more. We want what we see, not what we know we shouldn't have. Okay? Discontentment is the root of coveting. And Paul actually compares coveting to idolatry in Ephesians. Let's look at Ephesians 5:5, where Paul compares coveting to idolatry.
For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God.
Yeah, no immoral, no impure, or covetous man, and then he identifies covetous man, one who is an idolater, okay, will have any inheritance in the kingdom of God. Paul understood that man often worships his desires, not God. Coveting brought forth the first sin of man. Satan used it to separate us from God. Coveting was the first sin. And I believe that's why Paul uses that very sin in Romans here, and that very action as his example to the Roman people. We see in Romans 7:7 that the law is not sin, but it reveals our sin. Had God not given the command, had God not given the command not to eat from the tree, we would have no knowledge of sin, would we? You know, maybe that's why there's so little knowledge of sin in our society today. Because there is so little knowledge of God. The more we know God, the more we know Scripture, the more we recognize our sin, don't we? All right, let's go on to Romans 7, verse 8.
But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is death.
Yeah, here we see Paul tell us that sin took its opportunity. Okay? All right, how did sin take its opportunity? Well, as I looked at it, in Adam and Eve's case, sin didn't even exist in the human race before the giving of that one commandment from God. You shall not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And before God gave that command in Eden, Satan had no opportunity to seduce Eve, did he? There was no commandment for them to break, was there? But the giving of that command changed all that. And Satan seized his opportunity. Through Adam's disobedience, both he and Eve acted like adulterers. They rejected God's love and embraced sin. And as a result, the covenant that God had made with Adam was terminated. And man entered into a relationship with sin, and the law was powerless to change any of it. All right, let's read 7 verse 9. We're going to finish this. I know it's getting late, but we'll finish this.
I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died.
All right, now who is he speaking of here? Is the I there Paul? I once was alive apart from the law. I think he's talking about Adam, because this statement can only be true of Adam and Eve. They were alive and lived in fellowship with God. They were the only ones that ever lived in fellowship, one-on-one with God. And when they sinned, they lost their fellowship with him. They died spiritually. And we saw Paul tell us this earlier in Romans 5, verse 12. Read that, Rusty.
Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all have sinned.
Yeah, through Adam's sin entered into the world, and through sin and through sin, so too entered death. This death is the same death that we see here in chapter 7, verse 9, what Paul's talking about. This death is spiritual death, one that separates us from God. And this brought an end to man's fellowship with God and established humanity's bondage to sin. All right, let's read verse 10, chapter 7, verse 10.
And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me.
And he's talking about this commandment. And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. For sin, that's, yeah. And that commandment goes right back to what he's been talking about, this commandment. Obedience to the commandment of God would have brought with it life, but it actually proved to result in our spiritual death because it was disobeyed. God had made man perfect and gave him but one rule, one law. Don't eat the food from this tree.
That's
Okay?
so they could show loyalty to him
Exactly.
and love for him.
Exactly. And God promised Adam and Eve life on condition of their obedience. Okay? The law was their protector, but they rebelled against the law. And their disobedience sentenced them to death, spiritual death. And spiritual death came to all their ancestors. And folks, we are all their ancestors. All right, let's read verse 11. I'll try to finish this up quickly.
For sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me.
Yeah, here Paul continues to talk about the Garden of Eden and the serpent. Paul sees sin as a predator, waiting to attack and kill. Satan saw his opportunity and knew that the law given by God for a blessing could be used against Adam and Eve. And as he enticed them to disobey, he turned them against God and put them into a guilty position before the one who loved them. All right, let's read in verse 12 now.
So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good.
And so here Paul is bringing this argument to a close. He says, so then, which is the Greek word hoste, which means therefore. So then, Paul is answering the question that he brought about in chapter 7, verse 7, when he asked, is the law sin? And of course he immediately answered, no, may it never be. No way. But now he's telling us that the law is holy. And the commandment given to us was holy, is holy. It's righteous and good, far from sinful. The law is holy. It comes from a holy God and searches out sin. It is righteous because it lays the just requirements on people, and it forbids and condemns sin. And this is good because its purpose is to produce blessing and life. And ultimately, all these attributes express the character of a living God whose commandment it is. The problem here is not with the law, because he said, is the law sinful? No, the problem's not with the law, it's with the flesh. And Paul tells us just that in chapter 8, verse 3, when he says, for what the law could not do, weak as it was in the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of human flesh as an offering for sin, condemning the flesh. The law couldn't produce God's righteousness, but it wasn't the law's fault. The problem was with the flesh. But what the law couldn't do, God did. And Paul has exonerated the law from being identical with sin. The law is holy, the law is just, and it is good. And these questions that Paul knows these people are asking, especially the Jews, that's why he's answering. Because all these things they're wondering, is the law sin then? May it never be. It never was that. It's us who are sinful. Thoughts?
Well, the law actually gives us the opportunity to feel like that by being good, we're earning
That's right. We're earning.
God's favor rather than needing to accept his salvation.
That's right. Yep.
But we're supposed to be obeying out of thanksgiving.
That's right.
Not that superiority
That's right.
of thanksgiving.
Let's see what he's answering, because he's saying, if we're looking at all this in the way that he's saying, and the people are asking the question, well, is the law sinful then? And he's saying, no, it's not. All of it's holy. It's us that are sinful. And the law totally points to our sin. And we have to die to it. And that must have been tough on Paul, telling people to die to the law. This is something they've been keeping for 2,000 years.
But he wasn't just saying you need to die to it. He was saying we don't have to live in it now because of Jesus.
That's
That
right,
was his
because of
main
leaving.
message.
That's why you have to die. But you live. That's why he said a couple verses earlier before we studied last time, you die to the law, but you go to live, you go to be married to Jesus. Yeah.
Whenever he says the law is holy, he's talking about the simple law instead of all the complex laws that.
Well,
Yeah, it is
I
kind
would
of
say-
confusing.
I would say
I would say like
that it's
Jesus'
the Ten Commandments, but it's also the law that God gave to the Jews.
That's right.
Not the ones the humans added. Those
Right.
were not holy at all. But until Jesus defeated, the curtain was ripped apart, that was how they showed holiness, because all of those sacrifices they did were all to atone for their sins temporarily until the Messiah came.
Until the Messiah came, and then the
So
Messiah
they
did
weren't-
come. Yeah.
The law God gave Moses was not unholy.
Yeah.
It was holy.
Not at all,
Even
yeah.
when he gave them they messed up. They didn't obey the Ten Commandments, so then all those other laws on top of that to show that, so that if they performed those laws righteous, it was a temporary release of their sinfulness, and it was supposed to show the people around them who God was. But
Right.
they messed it all up.
But then Jesus got asked a question once. A guy came to him and said, what is the greatest commandment? And what did he say? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength,
Love your neighbor.
and love your neighbor as yourself. He said the other is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself.
So Jesus said, I didn't come to the law, I came to
Fulfill it. That's right.
fulfill it.
That's what
Over.
that's what the Messiah was supposed to do. And did they know he was the Messiah at that time? I don't think they did.
Who?
People. I mean, did they know that Jesus was the Messiah then? I don't remember.
When Paul?
No, when he said, I did not come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill
Well,
it.
he was saying that.
Because that was early on, and people were saying, oh my God, he thinks
They
he's the
probably
Messiah.
tried to kill him when he
Yeah.
said it.
Yeah.
This guy thinks he's the Messiah. How can he be the Messiah? Well, guess what? He is. Yep. Okay, anything else?
I have a quick, well,
Yeah.
in my Bible it says, the footnote was kind of interesting. It said, where there is no law, there is no sin, because people cannot know that their actions are sinful unless the law forbids it. And it says, sin is real and dangerous. Imagine a sunny day at the beach. You plunge into the surf and then you notice a sign that says, no swimming sharks in the water. Your day is ruined. Is it the sign's fault? Are you angry with the people who put it up? No, the law is like the sign. It is essential and we're grateful for it, but it does not get rid of the sharks.
There you go. That's good.
Oh, wow, okay.
good, yeah.
Still sin.
All right, let's pray.